Like today, we will talk about low resource NLP. And then we will first let the speakers have a brief intro of themselves, followed by question and answering for any question you have on the topic. And then we take them one by one all the way until we hit the next hour. So with this, maybe we'll start alphabetically. We start with Antonio's with an intro and a brief thought on the topic.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Adonis. I'm a professor at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, although I'm currently in Baltimore for a workshop at Johns Hopkins. I like anything that has to do with languages, but since my undergrad, I've worked with very underserved communities. Like I started my work working with a Greek dialect that is severely endangered in undergrad, where we did some data collection and I worked with linguists. Then eventually ended up doing a PhD where my thesis was on NLP for endangered languages documentation. So basically seeing how we can develop tools to help the linguists in the process of documenting languages. And now that I'm faculty, the vast majority of my research evolves around low resource settings, long tail languages, and working with communities to build whatever it is they want or need. So yeah, that's the introduction. The very general introduction. I've worked, it's very nice to see some people that I know here, some people that I don't, but I know of their work. Like I really like Luis's Guarani papers, and I really like Oana's OCR for low resource MP papers and all. So, okay, so I'll just stop here. My very first thought is that maybe we should not be thinking, and this is not a dish at the whole session. It's more like maybe, of course, low resource when it comes to data and potentially compute is a big issue. But for all of us, it would be much better to think of languages not in terms of their just amount of data that we have, and not put them in a negative side as like in the, oh yeah, it's a low resource language. No, it has resources, we just haven't leveraged them yet, or we don't know how to access them yet, or how to these underserved languages as opposed to perhaps low resource. So that's my very first thought, and then we can talk about everything else later.
Great, awesome. Then we will next go to Luis, then Oana.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this. It's the first time I participate in one of these mentorship sessions. And I'm Luis from Uruguay. I'm in Montevideo right now and did my PhD here. This is in South America. And I work with some low resource languages like Guarani, which is a South American indigenous language, which, well, when we started, it was extremely low resource, that there were not too many digital resources to work with. Nowadays, we can say that there are at least a little more. And also I work with some sign languages. So those are like really low resource. Like sometimes you have, I don't know, 200 sentences to work with or something like that. So yeah, it's kind of hard. But I agree with everything that Adonis said. It's like we have to think about the languages like they are underserved, and that in fact there's a lot of things we can do, and a lot of really nice work we should do in order to provide for the communities that use these languages. In fact, one thing about Guarani is that it's not an endangered language in the sense that there are a lot of speakers. I mean, there are like I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 million speakers, but it is more of an oral language, so there are not many digital or written resources, and the written resources are mainly ancient and difficult to process. And so there's a distinction between the languages that are really endangered, like they have, I don't know, 100 speakers or 1,000 speakers. Those must be quite more difficult to work with. I think. And some like Warni, the point is it's trying to access those resources, trying to contact the native speakers, trying to build more resources in order to work with them. So there's a distinction there, right? In endangered languages where there are really few speakers, and the kind of work you have to do is different, and low resource languages because the resources have not been built yet. So yeah, that's a small distinction I wanted to make.
Perfect. We'll go to Oana.
Sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Oana. As I said, I'm Romanian, but currently I'm living in US. I'm doing a postdoc here at University of Michigan. And so my PhD was on a different subject. I work on multimodal. I still work on multimodal, like video and images and also text. And during my PhD, I focused mostly on human action understanding using social media videos. And the data was only in English. And then I realized, wow, there are a lot of YouTube videos, social media videos in other languages too. And it would be great if we can extend this to other languages and make these technologies work for everyone. So starting with this postdoc, I work more on like trying to diversify the languages and the countries we're looking at in multimodal in videos and images. But yeah, as Antonius mentioned, I also worked on a paper for OCR. So during my internship, like 2 summers ago, I was at Meta, and I worked with Paco Guzman. And yeah, they have this great data sets, Flores 100, Flores 200, for 100 languages or 200 languages. They're really great benchmarks for machine translation. And I was amazed of how much you can do, and like you can work on so many languages. And that's when I learned that, wow, there is so much diversity, and I was really attracted to that. And yeah, I have this paper that you can check out. I think it's really valuable. It's called OCR Improves Machine Translation for Low Resource Languages. And we show how OCR data can be used for back translation to improve machine translation for low resource languages. And we even found some resources, like I remember for Nepalese, we found like a data set, like a library of books online that were free to access, and you could just OCR them and use them for back translation as more data to add to translate better Nepalese. So yeah, you can do this for many other languages. So I think OCR is really valuable. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Sounds great. We have a panel of like all the mentors with very good expertise on this question and a lot of passion into the low resource NLP topic. I'm Zhijing. I'm a senior PhD in the later stage of my PhD now. And then Oana, me, Radha, and then a bunch of us are promoting not only this mentorship program, we're also promoting NLP for social good. So I myself have quite a lot of work analyzing social media and see the political trends over there. What does it mean for our society and so on? Yeah, with this, we will first have a round of survey just to make sure our background. So as I've seen in some existing questions posted on Slido, inspired by that, how many of us are before in career stage before entering a postdoc or a further thing? So it includes from undergrad to PhD, that's career range. How many of you are in that career, like before PhD graduation? Maybe raise your hand on Zoom if you are before PhD graduation, anytime in this more junior range. I myself will raise the hand. I haven't graduated yet. So we have one more hand. I also see on Slido questions similar to people haven't published their research papers. maybe keep your hand on or raise your hand if you haven't yet published your first STAR ACL conference research paper. And maybe it's part of your goal today to also get some experience of how is a research paper like. I will. Okay, great. We see some increasing number of hands. Maybe you do need some research suggestions, and so we have 5, 6, 6 hands so far. Okay, maybe feel free to keep the hands on so that we get a really better estimation of the crowd's need. So maybe given this, I could read out some questions specifically fitting for this audience. So the question reads, I have been collecting low resource languages with volunteer ways. Is it possible to open source the data set? And how can I frame it to my first NLP paper to submit to my first NLP conference?
I can take that question, I guess. Well, it really, so on whether you can actually release the data set, it really depends on how you collected it, right? So if you work with speakers, and you record audio, for example, you need to have permission in advance that they are okay with you releasing their voice to the internet, right? If you're just collecting data that already exists otherwise, say off of the internet and then repackaging them, most likely it's okay. Then there's issues with potentially books and copyrights. So yeah, it really depends on where the data comes from, right? So that's the first question. The other question on, okay, you have the data, and let's say you can release them. How can you write your first paper in NLP? The first answer is just simple, right? You can write a resource paper. There's dedicated conferences specifically for language resources. A very good example is LREC, Language Resources and Evaluation Conference, which happens every 2 years. It has a fairly high acceptance rate, so that if you have a reasonable resource, especially something in an underserved language, is very much appreciated, according to my experience. That's a great way to get started with publications in NLP, but especially for an under-resourced language. That's my suggestion first, right? It's you can always try to do even more and repackage in a way your work as more researchy, or depending on what type of data you collected, right? If you're collecting speech data, then there's speech conferences that you can target. If you're collecting multimodal data, then you could target other conferences too. But if we're only talking about language data of any sort, my first thought would be LREC, which also happens to happen every 2 years in very nice locations. So that's another plus.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if
something.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to agree with Antonio said, and about LREC, it's happening. I think the deadline is happening soon, right? It's in October, so there are a few months, so you can plan your paper. I think this is the first time that it's done together, LREC and Calling, and I don't know how it changes the balance of the different reviewers and things, but generally it's what Antonio said. It's a very welcoming conference, so it's easy to access, and all the papers about new corpora, especially for new languages, are very welcome. So one thing, I think this question said something that the corpus was collected from volunteers, I think. So one thing that happens with low resource languages is that generally people are very protective of their language. So be careful with that. Be careful not to go against the sensibilities of the speakers. Maybe they just were volunteers and they agreed to publish it and use it not only as research, but also to give it to a greater public. But sometimes they are quite protective, and they want to know what you're going to do with your data. So just be careful with that, and try to ask to the speakers, to the contributors, and tell them what you're going to do with the data.
Thank you. I can also go next. I see a question about OCR. So what options do we have for OCR of handwriting for low resource languages? And I agree, having handwriting is more challenging, but from my experience, you can still use some open source models like Tesseract. It's maintained, and I also talk about it in the OCR paper that I put in the chat. So I think that's a good option. If you want some free software that is well maintained, you can try Tesseract, and it should also work on handwriting, but with a lower accuracy.
I can also chime in on this because we have a project on OCR for very low resource languages. Another idea beyond Tesseract, which is actually really cool, is that you can always get some initial output from whatever open source model, either Tesseract or like the Google API or Kraken or whatever is your favorite OCR open source toolkit. And then you can spend a little bit of time to correct something like 5, 6, 8, 10, 20 pages of that output, and then very easily train a post-correction model so that along with a very small language model on that language, because presumably if you need to get data out of books to do OCR, you very likely don't even have any other data out there or enough to train a language model. So you can very easily train a post-correction on very little data. There's a series of papers by Chiruzzo, who just finished her PhD about a year ago, and she's now at Google, where we did this, and we showed that very quickly, with as little as like 5 pages of corrections, you can very quickly drop the error rate from like something like 30 to like 10, like something from really bad to somewhat usable. And that's really a way that I'm excited about for getting data, especially for long tail languages, because, you know, especially for communities, well, that traditionally write their language, it's very likely that data exists offline, right? In magazines, in newspapers and all. So, or even in linguistic documentation efforts, that, you know, there's data sitting in archives. So if we could digitize those and make them machine readable, it'd be it's certainly a boost for all of those communities and languages.
Perfect. So now we will go to, I already start to see some votings for the questions. So we'll go from the top to down. Some are maybe some beginner questions about how to use monolingual corpora for neural machine translation. Maybe the questions sound like how to use unsupervised training if the language is low resource.
I can try to answer something to that. Maybe it's not that useful. The reality is that if it's actually low resource, then you cannot do much with really cool neural networks architectures like transformers, and you might want to go back to other more simpler architectures, like maybe recurrent networks with attention, or even simpler systems. And one thing you can do if you have monolingual data and you don't have like a lot of monolingual data is try to train embeddings. I mean, embeddings also need some you need at least some data, but not as much as what you would need to use a transformers approach. But when you train an embeddings collection, you can use it to improve other types of systems. For example, a recurrent neural network lets you insert the pre-trained embeddings. So that is one way to make your monolingual data shine. And in some cases, it improves the results, especially if you are, for example, doing machine translation between a high resource language and a low resource one. You probably have a lot of embeddings for the high resource language, and for the other one, well, at least you can try to make some embeddings, but it's difficult. It's actually quite difficult to work with these modern methods when you have really very few data to work with.
If I may add something here, it's, perhaps the first question that one should be asking is, if all you have is a little bit of data, right? First of all, do you have anything else? Do you maybe have a dictionary that someone has created that you can potentially leverage to align the embeddings of your language to another more high resource one, right? Because that can be potentially very helpful. But regardless of that, the first question that I would ask is, does that community really need machine translation? Right? If it is again, situations vary across the world. You can have a very low resource language with like 10 million speakers, where obviously that's a need. Or you can have a low resource language with 2,000 speakers, where all they care is about teaching their language in school kids, and what they need is tools to just write their language online and maybe have predictive text, and then be able to do morphosyntactic analysis to teach kids or to do something like that, right? So yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there. But yeah, I absolutely agree with whatever Luis said about older models, smaller models, and try to maybe tie things to other higher source languages somehow through some sort of alignments to try to do better.
Thank you. I can go with the next popular question. So what are the ways of obtaining written content online for languages that are more oral in nature? My target language only has been Bible, dictionary, and little else.
I'd say if the language is predominantly oral, then you just have to do speech, right? You just okay, backtrack. The UNESCO has the Indigenous Decade of Indigenous Languages, right? So which is a really big thing. Nevertheless, they have a big push on like standardization and creating an orthography for all languages and all, which I personally don't agree with, right? If the community is predominantly communicating orally, then it's up to us to build systems that can handle that. So a few years ago at an EMNLP, I think that EMNLP in Copenhagen, there was a very nice workshop named Speech-Centric NLP, right? And these years, in the recent years, there's a lot of progress in building models that can handle both speech and textual modalities. And I'd say, part of my work also in my PhD was also doing things like speech translation with a tiny amounts of data where nothing really worked at that time, but maybe now it would. I don't know with what we have. But if the language is oral, you gotta deal with that. Just work with speech directly, and then go to speakers and collect audio, or that would be my advice.
Sounds great. Thank you a lot for the sharing. I agree with many of the answers. Then let's move to another type of question that is common. I'm trying to cluster several questions so that we can go through more. Some of them are curious how to write about a dataset paper, but I think I could combine it with some other people asking about recommendation for a list of maybe well-written data set papers or so, or some low resource also modeling papers, so that people can imitate their writing and get bootstrapped for their own first paper. So we could either talk about maybe some high level suggestions, and then during the entire session, we can feel free to post links, or yeah, whatever way is good.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like in my mind, the dataset paper is somewhat straightforward to write. You just have to say, here's this gap, right? Here's this language that lacks this specific type of resource, or maybe lacks all types of resources. You ideally will provide some background on the language, because that's always interesting. And most of us here actually care about languages and all, so we always like to learn about new languages. And then you want to describe carefully what you did in order to collect the data set. You want to collect specific, you want to present statistics like how many hours of audio do you have? How many words, how many sentences do you have? Are there specific characteristics to the where you collected the data, either in terms of numbers of speakers or in terms of like the sources from where you got them? And then just provide all of the information. If you can, open source the data set, and then that's like the minimum that you would need for a dataset paper. I can recommend Luis's paper on like collecting a Guarani resource, for example, right? But you'll find a lot of such works in LREC. There's another very nice paper, I think it's again from LREC, on like collecting a Quechua speech translation thing, like Quechua and Spanish. To tout my own horn, Clayton, who's somewhere here, I think, and I wrote an ACL paper on collecting a multimodal corpus for Bemba. Perhaps it would be good to try, I mean, I'm not prepared, but we could send a list of like interesting papers for different types of, good papers for different types of resources, like speech resources, text resources, translation resources, to get started with.
If I can add one more thing to that, I don't know if our LREC paper for Guarani Spanish bilingual corpus was a perfect example of this. But one thing we did, and I think it's very important to do in one of these papers, is maybe you are a native speaker of the language, and then you have like 50% of the work complete, or perhaps more. But if you're not, then ask the native speakers. Just do some survey, see some information. For example, for this paper that Antonius was mentioning, we sampled some sentences of our bilingual data set, and we sent them to native speakers, and we said, well, okay, are these really good translations? How good are they? And we included that information in the paper, because that gives an idea of the quality of the data set, and also a validation of our intuitions, if they were good or not. And as I was not a native speaker of Guarani, I just learned it. Of course, my intuitions could not be as good as a native speaker. So it's very important to consult with them. In Spanish, we have a saying that says, it translates something like, the important thing is not to know, but to have the phone number of the one who knows. And so if you don't know yourself, you just ask someone who knows better, at least to validate that your intuitions are correct.
Absolutely. Quality assessment, right, is particularly important. If I may add just one more thing that I just thought about. So it's by no means a requirement, but a resource is very likely tied to some sort of task, right? If you want to do MT in a language, you are going to collect parallel data. If you want to do speech recognition, you're going to collect speech and transcriptions. If you want to do just language modeling and build GPT in your language, then you might just collect raw data, for example, right? So if you tied it, your data collection to a task, then a particularly helpful thing that will make your paper look better, although again, by no means a requirement, especially at the conference like LREC, would be to try and provide some baseline numbers, right? So you can grab off some open source toolkit that implements a model for the task that you're trying to solve with your data, and then provide a baseline number for people to see, you know, how would they do on your data, like how far are we from actually solving this. And in most cases, we're going to be very far, and then that will make more people try to solve this because it's a challenge, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. That is really good advice. I also found an interesting question. So what do you think about, or can you use generative models to create content for speech or for text? What do you think about that?
For low resource languages? Like how?
Yeah, low resource, or the person gives an example for Arabic, L2 Arabic speech.
Okay, I think Arabic is not that low resource, so maybe the models work more or less well. But for low resource languages, the generative models don't work at all. I mean, for what I've seen so far, it's like it generates just garbage. You shouldn't use them unless you are, I mean, you know the language and you can actually check that the generative model is doing a good work. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend it because it would be like adding more noise into the data. Yeah, and on top of that, if you are using for a high resource language, be careful with that, for using generative models to generate synthetic data. You could use it to pre-training, but not to train the final model, because it actually generally carries a lot of noise.
Yeah, I will second everything Luis said. Things like ChatGPT or whatever is your favorite open source thing, they're accidentally multilingual. Okay, they're not multilingual by design, which is one. Two, they will often output things that look very reasonable. So, unless you're a native speaker of the language, you won't understand that it's just garbage. I do want to say, however, that in some of the work that I'm doing here at Johns Hopkins this summer, we have found, I mean, it depends on the generative models that you work and on the level of the language that you work with. I will give you one positive example, which is that most languages have a fairly transparent orthography in terms of the pronunciation. Whatever you see written is how things are largely pronounced, right? That's very different from English or Chinese, but English is very weird about its pronunciation, right? So with very, very little effort, one can build a text-to-speech system. And today we have very good speech synthesizers. So we have found that we can not entirely from scratch, but we can augment existing speech translation data sets with a lot more synthetic data, like synthesized voices over existing texts, to build speech recognition and speech translation for languages that have as small as like just 4 hours of actually annotated data. But then we can leverage generative, like speech generative models, like text-to-speech systems, to synthesize speech, to build a system that goes in the opposite direction. But that's the only success story that I can think of as of now for low resource languages. But again, not extremely low resource. Think like low resource as in Tunisian Arabic or Korean, which is surprisingly low resource for some tasks, right? So it's not by any means the language that most people here, according to what I've seen in the chat, are interested in.
Sounds great. Thank you a lot for all very good advice. And yeah, I totally second the intuition that LMs are accidentally multilingual. And I also test certain questions in low resource languages. And I basically translate the question into all the languages that Google Translate support, and only around the top 50 like GPT does understand them, but all the others, it didn't even understand what the question means. So strongly supports this intuition. I'll go through some other questions, such as some are more technical questions. What are the most efficient ways to do transfer learning from a high-level language models? Maybe from a high resource language models? Yeah.
Yeah, efficient ways in terms of what? Efficient in terms of compute, in terms of data. I'd say okay, there's a lot of things that influence transfer learning, right? Even if you start with a multilingually pre-trained model like multilingual BERT or XLMR, that can produce decent representations for like the languages that they have seen. There's a lot of things that influence whether you can transfer from these high resource languages to low resource ones, right? Do the two languages use the same script? Are they related? Phylogenetically or typologically, right? Do they have any other similarities? Do they, even if they're not related, do they share perhaps some lexicon, some of their lexicon, right? Some of the vocabulary items. If the answer is yes to any of these, then maybe yes, you can transfer. There will be some transfer happening, right? But so that's at least what I've seen in my experience. That said, I've also seen transfer across languages that are unrelated. Maybe they don't share almost anything, and yet pre-training on one seems to help on others, right? There was a paper very recently on dependency parsing, if I'm not mistaken, that showed that, you know, there's a universal dependencies effort that has syntactic parses under the dependency formalism for like 150 languages at this point, and they did cross-lingual transfer experiments, and for some reason Romanian was the best one to transfer according to what we currently have. I don't know why. I honestly don't know why. And you know, it's not like all of the languages that they have there are Indo-European or Romance in any way, right? Although they're heavily biased, of course. But anyway, so I don't have a you know, there's too many things that can happen. But I'd say a good way to get started is maybe start with the pre-trained model. You can do something like continued fine-tuning or use adapters or something like this to also be compute efficient, and see what you get. But always keep in mind that maybe if you have just a little bit of data, a bespoke solution just for that language, like monolingual word embeddings, like Word2Vec or fast text embeddings in that language, might actually be a better solution. Like might actually work better downstream.
Yeah, I agree with that. If I can ask one more thing, one more thing to check if there are other languages. Generally, with low resource languages, what happens is that the speakers are generally code switching it with other languages, with other like context languages that are spoken in the same country or something. One clear example is when we study Guarani, it is generally code switched with Spanish a lot, or with Portuguese. And so that much level of code switching makes that there are many words that are shared between them, even if the languages are not phylogenetically related. What happens is that they tend to have some similar vocabularies in some ways sometimes. So they share some, let's say it's not words, but they share some loan words that could be translated between one and the other. So maybe using one of those frequent code switched languages could help in order to make transfer learning as well. Another thing to try. Of course, it's not a panacea.
One more thing that I just remembered on top of this is that when you go in the long tail of languages, like really anything beyond the top 200 or top 400 languages, then other things, other assumptions that we generally take for granted start to break. So maybe you don't have a standardized orthography. So then you might have the same word in your corpus written 3 or 4 different times. right? So then that means that any solution you build should maybe try to account for that, right? Or which is, actually great. There's research to be done if you want to do research, or it's a problem if all you care about is getting a system going. So because there's not necessarily a really good solution to this. So, question everything. Question all of the assumptions that you take for granted when you work with high resource languages. Or maybe there's like competing scripts. I've worked with languages that can be written either in Greek or Arabic or the Latin script, and you might get data in either of them, and it's still the same underlying language. So you gotta build solutions that can handle all of that, right? So
yeah, I mean, inconsistencies in orthography are all over the place. Like it happens in high resource languages, and it happens a lot more in low resource languages, especially if they have an unstable orthography that has not been standardized. And also it happens that they change through time, like any other language. So you might find like older scripts that were written in a completely different way, and a new modern version of the language that are absolutely different. So yeah, challenging your assumptions about how language work is one thing, and the other thing that is important in general to work with these languages is that don't underestimate the grammar knowledge, right? Like they are generally like not always, but sometimes they are well documented, so you can actually have access to grammar knowledge and get a lot of knowledge from that and infuse it in your models. Like so don't underestimate it. Please take some time to learn the grammar, to understand the rules, because there's a lot of knowledge there that is very useful for working with.
Thank you so much. Yeah, about the Romanian being the one that works the best with the parser. I don't, maybe it's because Romanian might be the closest to Latin, or that's a common belief that I hear a lot of times. And then I saw that it might be the closest in grammar to Latin. But this explains the Romance languages, so I don't know.
yeah, it does explain all the others, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so maybe a last question, or we see how much time we have, but a question that I see a lot is, what are the unexpected challenges you face when working with low resource languages?
Yeah,
I
well,
can potentially join
yeah,
a little bit with, because Lori, Lori Levin, although she couldn't join, she sent a message about a rule of thumb. Like she said, if I were to give any advice, it would be to keep in mind that the people who speak low resource languages need stuff that works, which may or may not be innovative enough to count as research. You should always respect the needs of the community. So I guess maybe the interaction with the real people is really important here.
yeah, absolutely second that. I was trying to think of like unexpected things. Basically, everything I've been saying today are things that, as someone who, started working on Greek and Spanish, which are fairly not as high resource as English, but very high resource languages. Like all of the things that I shared today are things that at some point seemed unexpected to me. I was like, what? This language has like 3 orthographies? Why? Turns out, sure, yeah, like some communities do that. Or what? They don't write the same way because, each different linguist went in and documented the language in different ways. And now you have through, a mess. Sure. So yeah, so all of this is just yeah, it's that's the thing that I would I suggest. So and then absolutely second the talking to native speakers. One important thing is, I want to hammer that point more. One of the papers that we published, or one of the work that we did with the Mapuche community in Chile, where we built a morphological analyzer basically for the language to put in their classrooms of the Universidad de Chile. It wasn't
ACL.
Jamilu, you're unmuted if you could mute yourself. But you know, it was like we just took an existing previous FST that a linguist had developed that we repurposed in order to build something that worked, right? But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't research in the sense that it was a novel way to do morphological analysis and a novel way to do something. It was research in terms of like, let's try to build something that works, that is useful for the community. And that's in my view more important if you care about the community, and you will find the venue to publish it eventually.
Yeah, one more thing I might add is that I was thinking about unexpected challenges, and one challenge that we had when we started working with Guarani is that it was very difficult actually to contact the native Guarani speakers. I mean, we thought it was not going to be that difficult in that they would be willing to collaborate and do stuff, but it took a lot. They sometimes didn't even reply the email, so it took a long time to actually contact some researchers, and now we have like a good team of researchers and contacts that can answer our questions. But one thing that happens is that, as I mentioned before, the speakers of the languages are protective about the language, and also it's true what I think Jean said, that they want systems that work and not actually the systems with the latest fanciest technology. So sometimes building something smaller that actually works for them, for example, building a keyboard for the cell phone for actually being able to produce the symbols that they use in their language, is something that helps them a lot more than having a machine translation system or a speech system. Okay, so Jamilu, I think you are unmuted, and perhaps you want to mute. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to log in as host,
sorry,
but it
I'm
needs
looking
some
for it.
verification. But maybe we could. Sure. Yeah. Thanks. That would be helpful. Cool. So maybe we could potentially end the mentorship with one or two sentences of summary or takeaways or rule of thumbs from each of us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say that there clearly is a ton of work that still needs to be done. And I think that everyone is here, and given all of the interest that I've seen on the chat and all of the languages that were mentioned here, that it looks like, you know, there's definitely still a lot of work to be done. So one thing that is not necessarily advice is like, if you want to do research, it's also just okay to reach out to other people who have done this before for other communities, right? Like we're doing now, but feel free to like cold email people like me or other people who do work that you like, and be like, hey, I want to do something for my language, or hey, I have this community that I'm working with and we're trying to do something. Do you have any input, or do you have any way to help? Maybe a lot of the people will just never respond to that email, and I will entirely understand them because I get like 500 emails a day. But one might, right? And you can like, to be honest, the low resource NLP community and the multilingual NLP community is a very nice one. And most people are just excited to help communities, in my experience. So we really, most of us really do care about this work. So don't be afraid to like find someone more experienced and try to like pick their mind, or like get some guidance on how to go about things. If your goal is to publish, if your goal is to build something that works, again, that's also a way to go. But you know, there's a lot of resources out there anyway, so you don't really need that these days. But yeah, the only other thing that I will say again is work, if you're not the speaker or a member of the community, work closely with the community to understand what they want and what they need. Because there's no point in building a chat GPT for them if they don't want one.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Just work more closely with the native speakers. They have the final word and the real intuition and on how to work with the language, and they also know what they need. And also, again, I want to say that don't underestimate the grammar knowledge, and take the low resource languages as an opportunity to revisit older methods. Like it is possible to use not these latest transformers and ChatGPT things, but also revisit what happens with the grammars, what happens with transfer rules, what happens with statistical methods that are pre-neural network errors. And those methods tended to work better with fewer data. So revisit them and you might be surprised that some things still work very well.
I totally agree. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we already attracted some new generation for the low resource language community with this panel. And let me just thank you again to Luis and Antonios, and also all the people who has accompanied us through this very happy hour. Awesome. Wish you the best of the day and see you around. Thank you
all.
again.
Hope it was
Thank you.
helpful.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.